Why is it so effective over time?
Well, this is an area where I had to consult with other experts because it turns out really to be a neurological function. And it was first explained to me by a professor at Harvard Medical School, and it has to do with the way the human brain remembers things, the way we learn things, the way we create patterns and associations and reinforce, well, I don't know, it's sort of like channels in the brain that when certain things trigger certain collateral thoughts. And when you associate one thing with another, over time, just the mention of the one brings the association of the other. What this sometimes means is that even when something is later exposed as a lie, if it was accepted as the truth for a long time, the exposure of it as a lie is not believed. It's in one ear and out the other. The best example that we know in my field is one that John Stockwell reported on. He was a CIA officer in Angola, for Angola, but they were based, the CIA station was based in Congo. And when the Cuban troops were sent in to help the Angolans fight the South Africans during the early and mid-70s, the CIA's task was to try to discredit the Cubans and do whatever it could to make people around the world think it was a terrible thing that the Cubans were helping the Angolans. So Stockwell's group in Congo sat down and one guy says to the other, well, let's think of something terrible we can say that the Cubans did. And another guy says, hey, why don't we say they're raping Angolan women? That'd be a great thing to say. The other guy says, terrific, and they call in their media experts, and they start sitting there at their desk at the CIA office, and they start typing out these news stories about how a group of Cuban soldiers raped a bunch of Angolan women in some operation. And then they write story number 2, which is that the villagers got incensed and decided they didn't want the Cubans anymore, and they were going to find the soldiers who did it and arrest them. And story number 3, the villagers captured the Cubans. And story number 4, they were tried and by a jury of the women victims, and they were later executed with their own weapons. And they made a series of about 12 newspaper stories in a row. And with one phone call and one visit, it went over the wire services, it went into Europe, it went into the United States, it went around the world. And for about a 6-month period, there were all these stories about the horrible Cuban rapes in Angola. And what that does is, when you hear, the average person hears Angola or Cuban, they'll think rape of the women. And if they hear rape of women, they'll think Angola, Cubans. And if you hear Angola, they'll think Cubans, rape of the women. And these patterns build up so that that becomes the truth embedded in your mind. 4 years later, John Stockwell quit the CIA, wrote a book exposing it, wrote a big op-ed piece for the New York Times about how the entire Cuba-Angola story was a fabrication, and he sat there at the desk typing it. And the day after that story appeared, there were still 900 million people around the world who thought the phony story was true. Because when year after year after year you hear that something is the case, one story, one day saying, hey, the whole thing was a lie, and it doesn't register on the brain. It can't beat those patterns that have been built up.
Let's go back now, take the example, let's go back now to the general area of intelligence, because all of this activity is useless unless there's a structure into which it fits and which it can be put out. When you deal with the kind of structure of media operations that puts out this kind of misinformation, how extensive is it?
Yes, we have a lot of information about the CIA. We have a certain amount of information about the FBI, a certain amount about military intelligence. And the reason for this is because there were those congressional investigations that I mentioned before. There have been reports published, particularly from the Church Committee in the late 70s, where they published volume after volume describing the extent of media operations by the CIA and other agencies. The exact amounts of money that were being spent were not divulged by those initial reports because that was considered to be classified. The intelligence budgets are always classified, except at the same time every few weeks you'll read something in the newspaper where they say the classified budget, which is approximately $25 billion, so on and so on and so forth. So what we've learned from these reports is that the first thing was that about a third of the whole CIA budget went to media propaganda operations.
Well, a third of the CIA's budget went to media propaganda operations. How much would that be, approximately?
We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars a year just for that. I mean, the intelligence budget now, everything together is according to all these reports that say it's secret, but is about 25 to 30 billion dollars a year. Now, a lot of that is high-tech stuff, has nothing to do with what we're talking about, satellites and so on. But the stuff that goes to the CIA is several billion. And when you factor out overhead and things like that, you've got your operational amount. Most of the estimates suggest that hundreds of millions of dollars, close to $1 billion, are being spent every year by the United States on secret propaganda. Now, yeah, we have fairly good figures from the CIA because it at least has been admitted in the past that they did do this stuff. They admit they do it now, except they say they don't do it within the United States, but they admit that that's part of what they do. The FBI is much harder to get figures for because they don't generally admit to conducting media operations, and unless and until something gets exposed and they have to admit that particular operation, they deny to an extent where it's really hard to try and estimate how much money is being used by the FBI and by the military intelligence agencies. But it's sort of clear that hundreds of millions of dollars a year are being spent by various aspects of the government on deliberately creating and spreading lies.
Before we get into the specifics of media operations related to the Martin Luther King case, the James Earl Ray, can you give us, just to finish the background, can you give us some idea of the influence that the CIA and the FBI have had over the media?
Yes, again, this was something that very specific figures came out in the 70s and 80s, and we don't know the precise figures today. We have no reason to think that they are significantly less than what came out. But when the Church Committee reported on the CIA media operations, for example, beyond friends in the press, beyond having people who were just generally thought along similar lines, it turned out that they had thousands of journalists in their employ, not merely friendly, not merely agents, not merely someone you could pass a story to, but people who might have appeared to the outside world to be a reporter for CBS was in fact a CIA employee getting a salary from the CIA, and that was repeated thousands of times all around the world. They also owned outright the CIA at that time, about 250 or more media organizations. That's wire services, newspapers, magazines, radio, TV stations all around the world that they owned outright. The actual shareholder of the company turned out to be some CIA front.